So my friend and colleague, Sarah, told me about a moment in class she took in seminary. And she said that the professor asked the students in the class, what's the opposite of anxiety? My friend Sarah, who is prone to anxiety, was most interested in the answer. And so students replied back their thoughts. You may have some that you would have thrown out into the classroom about what would be the opposite of anxiety. The reality is there isn't really a right or wrong answer. It's just the perspective of the teacher who said to his students, the opposite of anxiety is curiosity. Not exactly what I had expected. And it's a message that sort of stuck into Sarah's mind and heart and has shifted the way she looks at her own anxiousness and anxiety. This month's theme is of wonder. And last week, we talked about wonder connected to awe and mystery and delight, the kind of wonder that fits with the word wonderful, meaning full of wonder. And today we'll look at the word wonder from this perspective of being curious and open to learning. Wonder can be a powerful tool when it comes to understanding ourselves and staying present. In the story we heard earlier, the young girl had been thinking of all sorts of things that could go wrong during her recital. Her anxiety was increasing as she started to imagine these terrible what ifs. What if I make a mistake? What if no one comes? What if too many people come? Cora was described as feeling the weight of all her anxious what if thoughts. Her thoughts were quite in contrast to her friend Stella, who also had her own wonderings, but hers were, I wonder if there might be chocolate cake after the recital, or what if I played better than ever? Rabbi Marcia Prager wrote, where worry says, oh no, what's going to happen? Curiosity says, oh wow, I wonder what'll happen. There's an inherent joy in leaning into wonder and curiosity. Brene Brown, who many of you know of, an author and a teacher who studies human behavior and relationships and thought, says that anxiety is related to an intolerance of uncertainty. She says that anxiety is future-oriented. It takes you away from being present. You're imagining you're in the future of all the things that could happen. For me, when I find myself feeling anxious and my mind starts wandering in these endless negative what ifs, it feels almost like a pestering fly. Like I can try to distract myself from my anxiety and I can try to push it inside or engage in what's happening in the moment, but that anxiety kind of buzzes on, pulling my attention away from what I'm doing and often making me pretty brittle and cranky. When we're distracted by feelings that cause us to shut down, it can also cause us to miss out on the good things that are happening now. Brene loves to dive into research around our experiences of being human. And she said, when she was reflecting on herself, she said, I assumed that my emotions responded to my body freaking out. But really, she said, my emotions are responding to my thinking assessment of how well I can handle things. So she's saying thought actually comes for her many times prior to emotion. It's the thoughts that trigger that anxious feeling. They're kind of responding to these escalating thoughts. She describes feelings of anxiety like going through the tunnel of terror in Willy Wonka. I decided I'd go watch this scene after I heard her talking about it. You guys can Google it if you want. Just look at the tunnel of terror in Willy Wonka. It's kind of a freaky little scene. The scene starts with these families. You remember them all going to the chocolate factory, and they're in this fabulous boat getting ready to go into this tunnel. It's almost, the music is very playful at that moment. And then as the boat approaches the tunnel, you can hear the cries of a couple of the fathers, and then all of a sudden you're in darkness and the sounds and the visuals intensify. The families are screaming and images are projected on the walls of the tunnel. Willy Wonka becomes this kind of slow song or voice. It's a really disorienting scene, and one where Willy Wonka is kind of seen in this sinister mystery. As I watched it, it's sort of comical, both in filming, because of sort of the time that it was. It's a little rustic, let's just say. But it's also unnerving and a tad bit unbearable. Fortunately, relief comes at the end of that scene when the boat just stops and the lights turn on and the families are told it's time to get out of the boat and continue the tour. And then when I think about it, I understand why she brought that image up, because it does remind me of times when I imagine so many negative possibilities. And then that actual event or conversation or meeting or whatever happens and it passes. And when I'm on the other side of it, I wonder, why on earth did I put so much time into those negative imaginings? It's like I go from normal to chaotic and back to normal. Brene Brown says that anxiety, along with other personality realities of these kind of things that get our minds thinking, are both a state and a trait. So you could be born with a trait of anxiety, something that's kind of predisposed in your DNA, but then there's also that state of anxiety, which is a temporary condition. She says that an intolerance for uncertainty contributes to both the state and the trait. And whether we struggle with anxiety or other things such as depression, both which are genetic or conditional, they can both block our curiosity and our wonder. And then it can become kind of this vicious cycle, since curiosity and wonder can lead to a kind of a joy and adventure and new learnings, which ultimately can kind of remedy this feeling of us being isolated or shut down. Wonder and curiosity can lead us to change and transformation, where anxiety just leads us to a coping mechanism of worry or avoidance. As Polly mentioned, yesterday was our annual Blue Christmas service. It's one of my favorites, even though I swear every year I just end up crying. It kind of rips us all open in a way. One of the premises of that service, of the invitation of that service, is to take time together to invite in grief. We share the names of loved ones or circumstances that cause us to feel grief. And as we share stories, we light candles, and then we sing to each other. We sang, "We are sending you light to heal you, to hold you. We are sending you light to hold you in love." And then we take a little silence and the next person shares. The myth about grief is that if you let it in, it will consume you. And there still exists the myth that people should get over grief, that after a certain number of months or years, grief should be small enough to be contained and spoken of only in the past without really emotion. But in reality, grief shows up when it shows up. And when it does, whether by invitation or by surprise, it is best to let it in. Brown says that the same is true of worry. She says that rather than suppressing worry, we need to dig into it and address the emotion driving the thinking. Our anxiety and fear need to be understood and respected, perhaps even befriended. We need to pull up a chair and sit with them, understand why they're showing up, and ask ourselves what there is to learn. Wondering about ourselves and what makes us tick is how we learn to behave differently, and how we can find the ability to be more present and in touch with our feelings and others. We can ask ourselves, why am I reacting this way? Or is there a story behind this? Almost always there is. And when curiosity enters the picture of our emotional landscape, we can learn and we can have the ability to choose differently in the future. We can also choose to respond differently when we really look at it. We can decide that instead of reacting, we can choose to pay attention to our breath for a moment and slow down. We can decide to be quiet for a moment and just watch what happens. We can interrupt our auto response and potentially create a new way. Wonder can be a powerful tool when it comes to understanding ourselves and staying present. When a community like this community values wonder, all sorts of things can open up. We can learn to be more compassionate and open to one another. We can learn to live with uncertainty, even though we may be a little weary of that, and find ways to embrace the gifts that come from wondering and from not knowing. Interpersonally, this church is a great place of learning. Like neighborhoods and families, when you're part of a church community, you interact with people on an ongoing basis. And within that reality, we all have people we interact with ease. And then we have other people who create more of a challenge for us. And part of what we learn here together is how to be in beloved community with all, with everybody who's here now, and then how to remain open to the way that we and relationships can change over time. I remember being taught a while ago about, instead of kind of sitting back in my mind and saying or thinking like, what is wrong with you? To instead find a way to not create those walls between me and others, and instead perhaps ponder the question of what happened to you. That doesn't mean that I, sit with congregants, or you might sit with others and say what happens to you, but instead it's sort of a question in one's mind that can open a stance of curiosity, and that helps us move into queries that can open up stories and help create a bridge to one another and deepen our compassion for one another. So much of our thoughts and assumptions and behavior comes from prior experiences, coupled with our own disposition and body chemistry. Ideally, a community such as this one gives us opportunities to reflect on prior ideas and experiences. Ideally, we come to different understandings, and we have an ability to find a path that's grounded in love and a commitment to be our best selves. As a small congregation that has weathered the worst of the pandemic, and hopefully, and a severe market drop, which impacted our investments, we can easily get pulled into worry or anxiety, or we can open ourselves to wonder. I find myself, as you already know, probably if you were in services a couple weeks ago, I wonder about family ministry and what opportunities will continue to unfold. The truth is that religious education will likely not look like it did in the past. So what is it going to look like? I wonder about our potential name change and what we will learn about each other and our dreams of being accessible and welcoming as a congregation. I wonder about how we as a congregation might choose to be housed in the future. Will we eventually buy a building, or will we opt to be long-term renters, free from time and energy required in having a building that needs maintenance? Or will we deliberately choose to share a building? And always, this has been never ending. I wonder about newcomers and visitors, because there's just all sorts of reasons that someone looks for and finds us. And there are an equal number of reasons why people return and why they don't. Or why, even after being here for a while, they choose to do something else on Sundays. I believe is that we move through, and with all these wonderings, that we need to recognize our own feeling and experiences and listen carefully to one another. We have to stay curious and recognize where we may have shut down or shut off, and instead learn how to examine a new set of what ifs. The other week, when Diana and I were contemplating family ministry together, I shared what if that came from a series of classes I took with folks looking at family ministry. And the question was, what if families were at the center of the congregation? I think it's easy for me to think of this question and imagine the old model of church. But honestly, the church where I raised my kids, the kids were in the basement and the adults were in the sanctuary. It wasn't necessarily that families were at the center of the congregation. They may have been served, but it didn't look like families were in the center of the congregation. So that's just one question that I've started to ponder, and one that I hope we will dive more deeply into in the future. So we can look at wonder on the personal and interpersonal level, and also at the broader societal level beyond our walls. I don't know if any of you are Trevor Noah viewers, but he's a late night talk host, and he had his last show on Friday night. He did a long closing words, Linda and I could barely hold in, but what I did find interesting was he decided to focus quite a bit on the importance of context. He urged us not to take a story bite that has been posted in social media or shows up on those few minutes in a news broadcast, and instead to kind of step back and try to view the whole and complete picture. He urged us to be curious and to wonder about the bigger story, to tease out nuances and not to be so quick to jump to a conclusion. Brene Brown nods to this as well when she says, sometimes we have to rumble with a story to find its truth. I love that image of rumbling with a story. When we shut off wonder, we come to quick conclusions. We create barriers to one another and to new information. And in truth, we experience just a fragment of what is available to us. If we slow down and we remain curious and open, if we decenter ourselves and allow other information to come to us, the world is so much more expansive. I came across this poem last week. It's titled With or Without Candlelight by John Marsh. And it goes, if you're going to meditate by candlelight, don't hurry to light the candle. The glow may concentrate your energies, but it will cost you the contours of the room. If you walk the night forest by flashlight, the electric beam may reveal details on your path, but you will lose everything outside of your concentrated ray. All that your light does not expose will become alien. The sounds of the animals will frighten you. Shut off the beam, and you will travel the night forest as one who belongs. Let us praise things dark and beautiful, the quiet of closed eyelids, the childhood of chocolate, the respectability of newsprint, the suddenness of a bat's wing, the invitation of brewing coffee, the persistence of tar, the gentleness of nutmeg, the temptation of a cave. If you're going to meditate by candlelight, do not hurry to light the candle. So I think like when we close off wonder, it's as if we limit ourselves to just that single ray of light, and we only see a small part. And that small part doesn't allow us to sort of calmly hear and experience everything else that's in our midst. Ours, as you're probably aware, is a faith of wonder. It leans heavily into process and experience and learning. And my hope is that you have changed some of your thoughts or beliefs by being part of this community that celebrates and actively examines faith and that challenges one another with loving kindness to be our best selves and work for a flourishing world. Being our best selves is an active, not static way of being in the world. It doesn't mean we have to constantly be morphing into someone new, but it does mean that we continue to stay open to wonder in all its forms. One of my favorite memories of seminary were in my Old and New Testament classes. I was raised informally Catholic, and although I had a sense of the most common stories of the Bible, what that were told to me as a children, I wasn't really raised with the Bible as my central text. I noticed that I and other Unitarian Universalists in our classrooms would ask different types of questions. We came to sections of the Bible that we were studying with radically different perspectives than our classmates who were raised Christian and going into ministry in a Christian setting. I know that many of you were very curious questioners when you were young and in different churches or faiths. I also know that many of you were not greeted with as much kindness as we were in seminary. Sometimes it may have been your priest or pastor or religious education teacher who pushed you back or asked you to be quiet. Other times it may have been family members. Many of us, who I would call religiously curious, bring the faith of our past forward, or parts of the faith of our past forward, while many of us also leave many parts behind. I hope that like when you began, and then I guess those who left it behind really literally kind of began anew when they became Unitarian Universalist. But either way, here we can ask questions. Here we can share different perspectives. We can rumble together or alone with stories, and all of that is welcomed and encouraged. So one thing I really like about this movement away from traditional religious education with kids in these age-related classrooms separate from the adults in the Sunday services is that there's a strong recognition of what has always been true, which is that religious education or religious formation happens across the lifetime. We can think of our time together in Sunday services, in choir, in band, in small groups, in just social environments as learning labs for those who are practicing wonder in all of its form. There's a lot to learn, and there's a lot to unlearn. I am acutely aware that when it comes to many topics like racism, grieving, congregational development, to name a few, I not only have to learn, but I have to actively unlearn as well. When we think we know something, we can get really locked into a certain story, and then we lose that ability to examine our lives or to look at the community and the greater world in a contemporary setting. I think we all know people who act as if they know it all, and it's easy to see that those people are closed to learning and to growth. It's harder to see or acknowledge when we enter into that realm or dig in our heels and lose the ability to be open to informations and stories and emotions and responses ourselves. I don't like to think of myself that way, but I know there are times where that little know-it-all can show up. It's not super helpful. It's not like life is this big pie and there are only so many slices to pass out. The truth is that when we let go of old beliefs or history, maybe that pie analogy does sort of work in a way, because it's, as we let go of old, we do allow more space, we allow more expansiveness for new stories and new ideas and new beliefs to enter in. We can find ways to open our hearts wider to matters of the heart and of the mind. So I guess I've thrown out a few ideas here today, questions about our own ability to wonder and be curious, especially when anxiety or fear or closed-mindedness get in our way or preoccupy our minds or thoughts. Talked about wondering about each other and our own stories and about our shared future and how we might navigate this changing landscape and big decisions we'll be making together. And I've spoken about our faith, one that calls us to wonder in all of its forms, to evolve and to remain curious, to let that spark of curiosity lead us to new discoveries in ourselves and in the world around us. So we have a few moments. I'm just wondering if any of you have any reflections you would like to share about this part of wonder, the wonder of curiosity. And either it can be in any of these aspects. What were you wondering about when you looked at Unitarian Universalism? What have you found in yourself when you have decided to break down those barriers and enter into wonder versus locking in? I think I see Bruce with a microphone.
I'm Bruce, and I have a friend who talks about awfulizing, like for stress and anxiety. He uses the term awfulizing, and I kind of like that term, and I'm thinking of talking with him and saying, what do you think of the opposite of awfulizing being wonder? If we get together every now and then and just have coffee and a walk, and I kind of like the idea of wonder as the opposite of some of these things. But so often we talk about the problems and how awful it can be. And I like that, the definition of opposite being wonder.
It's a nice shift, isn't it? It's not what I had expected. I think I had expected the opposite of anxiety being calm or something, but it's more of a remedy, perhaps one could say. Is there anybody online who has anything they'd like to share? Byron, I saw your hand go up. Are you done over there?
I have something to share. I grew up in the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming. And I learned as a child to not be afraid of the dark by doing exactly what Laura spoke of, leaving the campfire, walking far enough away from the circle of light so that it's not scary darkness. And every trip elk hunting began with a 2-hour hike in the dark. So those were just great experiences. I've carried that metaphor with me.
Byron, thank you. I was just thinking as you spoke about, if one is, I forget what term Bruce used, but if you imagine that that's like this beam of light that you're sort of stuck on, how to move oneself out of that. I remember someone who talked about having a hard time meditating, so they would go out and do a sensory meditation. So they would just sit and see what they heard and what they smelled and what they saw, just sort of to feel your body and find a way to get yourself out of that hyper focus. I see Kevin with his hand up.
Hi, everyone. When I think about that curiosity, I've often been listening as people say, what if, which often prompts anxiety. What if this happens? But wonder also starts with what if. And so it's a fun excitement that you can begin a thought or a feeling or going down a road. And rather than what if the anxiety, you can go ahead and turn that into that what if curiosity. I like that.
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I do think we sort of assume the what ifs are going to be bad. So what if we play with those? Make them playful. All right, I think if it's quiet in the room over there, I think we will move into our hymn. Our closing hymn is number 323, Break Not the Circle. Just like before, the hymn leaders will be up front. People at home will be muted and can sing along. Those in person, if you'll keep your mask on, that would be awesome. And please feel free to rise in body or spirit.